Hello everyone and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story name: Beneath the Frozen Veil. It was the winter that broke them. The town of Craydon had always been small, quiet, and isolated, nestled between two hills, wrapped in a blanket of snow most of the year. It was the kind of place where people knew each other's names, but no one ever seemed to ask too many questions. The frozen landscape around them seemed to keep the world out. It was a town suspended in time, untouched by the rush of the modern world. For most of its inhabitants, that was enough. But then the storm came. It wasn't like any storm they had ever seen. It wasn't the usual heavy snow or the biting wind that howled through the trees. This one came fast, too fast, and it didn't leave. It settled over the town like a weight, like something alive, something that had decided to make Craydon its home. No one could leave. No one could escape. That was how Andy Barlow first found himself standing on the front porch of his small, rundown house, staring out at the blizzard that had swallowed the streets. His breath fogged the air as he glanced over his shoulder at his wife, Diane, who was standing just inside the door, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not letting up," Andy said, his voice tight with fear. He wiped a hand across his face, trying to shake off the creeping feeling that something was terribly wrong. "No," Diane replied softly, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "It's something else, Andy." Andy turned to her, his brow furrowing. He knew what she meant. There was something wrong with the storm. Something unnatural about it. "I'm going to check the generator," he said, pulling on his jacket and stepping out into the swirling white chaos. The cold bit at his skin like needles, but he barely felt it. His mind was too focused on the strange, suffocating weight of the storm. It was like the air itself had changed, growing thick and heavy with something sinister. He made his way to the shed where the generator was kept, his boots crunching in the snow as he moved. But something caught his eye, something that made his breath catch in his chest. At the edge of the yard, near the woods, there was a figure standing in the snow. A shadow, tall and thin, just standing there, unmoving. Andy's heart skipped a beat. "Diane?" he called, not taking his eyes off the figure. "Did you see that?" She didn't answer. Andy turned back toward the house, his heart hammering in his chest. His feet slipped on the snow as he stumbled toward the porch, his eyes darting back and forth, searching for any sign of movement in the storm. But the figure was gone. Just like that, as if it had never been there. His pulse quickened, and he hurried inside, slamming the door behind him. Diane was still standing there, but she was staring at the window, her face as pale as death. "There was someone out there," Andy said, his voice shaking. "A figure. I swear, it was just standing there in the snow. I saw it." She didn't respond at first. Instead, she reached out and pulled the curtains closed, her hand trembling. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke. "We're not the only ones here." And that was when Andy knew. There was something in the storm. Something that wasn't human. Something that had been waiting for them. The storm lasted for days. It wasn't like any storm they had ever experienced before. The snow kept coming, piling up against the house, blocking the roads, cutting them off from the rest of the world. The power went out, and the generator failed. They were alone, completely and utterly alone. Andy and Diane were forced to rely on what little they had left, their food stores dwindling with every passing hour. The storm showed no signs of stopping. It felt like it was pulling them deeper into some kind of abyss, and Andy could feel his sanity beginning to unravel. They had tried to venture out to find help, but the moment they stepped outside, they were overwhelmed by the oppressive weight of the storm. The air was thick with an icy fog that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Every step felt like it took them further away from reality, as if the storm itself was conspiring to keep them trapped in its icy grip. It wasn't long before Andy began to notice something else. Strange things. Little things at first, but they added up. The way the wind howled outside, almost like it was calling to them. The way the shadows seemed to shift and move in the corners of the house. The creaks and groans of the old wood, as if something was stirring inside the walls. And then there were the sounds. At night, when the wind was at its worst, they would hear something scratching at the windows. Soft, almost gentle, like the scrape of fingernails. At first, Andy thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him, but then it started again. And again. Every night it came. They tried to ignore it. Tried to convince themselves that it was just the storm, just the isolation, driving them mad. But deep down, Andy knew something was wrong. Something was coming. On the fifth night, the storm reached its peak. Andy was sitting in the living room, staring into the fire, his thoughts as cold as the wind outside. Diane was upstairs, trying to sleep, though they both knew sleep was a luxury they couldn't afford. The house creaked and moaned around them, as if the very bones of it were protesting the storm. And that was when he heard it. A whisper. A soft, guttural sound, like someone calling his name. Andy. It came from the direction of the stairs. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood, his body stiff with dread. He glanced toward the stairs, where the shadows seemed to be moving. "Diane?" he called, his voice trembling. "Is that you?" There was no answer. The whisper came again, this time louder. Closer. "Andy." His blood ran cold. This wasn't Diane. This wasn't anyone he knew. He moved toward the stairs, his feet heavy with the weight of fear. The house was silent now, save for the sound of his own breath. He reached the bottom of the stairs and paused, his hand gripping the railing. The whisper came again, more insistent now. "Andy." He started up the stairs, his pulse quickening, his breath coming in shallow gasps. As he reached the top, he stopped dead in his tracks. Diane was standing in the hallway. But it wasn't her. Her eyes were wide and empty, as if she were seeing something Andy couldn't. Her mouth was slightly open, as if she were about to speak, but no sound came out. And then, something moved behind her. A shadow, tall and thin, just like the figure he had seen outside. It loomed in the doorway to the bedroom, its shape indistinct, like smoke or mist. Andy's heart raced in his chest as he took a step back. "Diane?" he whispered, but she didn't respond. She didn't even blink. The shadow in the doorway moved closer. "Help me." The voice was hollow, distant, but unmistakably familiar. It was Diane. Before Andy could react, the figure in the doorway lunged forward, faster than he could comprehend. His breath caught in his throat as the shadow engulfed him, wrapping around him like cold hands. And then everything went black. Andy's body jerked awake, a sharp intake of breath tearing through his lungs as though he'd just surfaced from deep water. He was lying on the cold, hardwood floor of the hallway, his limbs heavy, like they were made of stone. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind was a mess of fog and panic. For a moment, he thought he had dreamed it. The whispering, the shadow, the suffocating presence that had pressed in on him from all sides. But as his eyes slowly focused, he saw the truth. Diane was still standing in the doorway of their bedroom, her eyes wide and empty. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. It was as if she were trapped in her own body, unable to speak, unable to move. Her body was stiff, her skin unnaturally pale. Andy tried to call her name, but his voice came out as a rasping whisper, barely audible. His throat felt raw, constricted, as though something had tried to choke the life out of him. He crawled toward her, his body shaking with each movement, but when he reached her, his fingers brushed against her arm, and it was cold. Cold in a way that no human being should ever be. A chill so deep, it made his teeth ache. Please, he whispered, his voice cracking. Come back to me. Come back. But she didn't respond. She didn't even look at him. Her eyes were locked onto something else, something that wasn't there. Her gaze was distant, vacant, as though her soul had been drawn away into some other place. A cold wind blew through the room, making the walls creak and groan. The storm outside raged on, its fury undiminished, but it was as if the house itself had become part of the blizzard. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, pressing down with a weight that made it hard to breathe. And then he heard it again. The whisper. It came from the darkness, from somewhere beyond the edges of the room, a voice that wasn't human, that wasn't alive. Beneath the frozen veil, Andy's blood ran cold. The voice was different now, louder, more distorted. It reverberated through his bones, making his entire body feel like it was vibrating with some unknown energy. He turned toward the source of the sound, but there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway, stretching out before him, the darkness swallowing everything in its path. He turned back to Diane, desperate now, his hands gripping her shoulders, trying to shake her out of whatever trance she was in. But as his fingers made contact with her skin, something shifted. A sudden jolt of cold shot through him, as if an icy current had surged into his very being. He gasped and pulled away, his body jerking back like he had touched an electric wire. And then, just for a moment, the world seemed to tilt, like the house itself was twisting, turning, as if reality were breaking apart at the seams. The whispering grew louder, filling the room, crawling into Andy's mind, wrapping itself around his thoughts like tendrils. Beneath the frozen veil, the lost ones wait. Andy shook his head, trying to clear the fog from his brain. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. It was the storm, the isolation. The cold had taken its toll on him, made him hallucinate, The floor beneath him creaked, the sound sharp and sudden, like a door being kicked open. His head snapped around. And that's when he saw it. A shadow. No, not a shadow, a figure. It stood at the far end of the hallway, just past the bedroom door, watching him with a presence that filled the entire space. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs that seemed to stretch out toward him, like the branches of a dead tree. Its face was a mask of shadow, featureless, but somehow wrong. It was like a living thing, an entity that had no shape, no form, but that was somehow more real than anything else in the room. Diane, Andy whispered, his voice trembling, his eyes locked on the figure. Please wake up. But Diane didn't move. She didn't blink. Her eyes remained fixed on the figure in the hallway, as though she were entranced, unable to look away. The figure in the hallway, however, was slowly drawing closer, its movements unnatural and slow, like something that didn't belong in this world. Andy's heart pounded in his chest, the pulse ringing in his ears. His mind screamed for him to run, to grab Diane and get out of there, but his legs wouldn't move. It was as if the very air was thickening, holding him in place, forcing him to watch as the thing drew closer and closer. The air grew colder. The very walls of the house seemed to be made of ice now, as if the storm had seeped inside, freezing everything, turning it into something alien, something unnatural. And then, with a sound like cracking glass, the figure stepped into the light. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was something much worse. Its face, if it could be called a face, was twisted, covered in ice and frost, the skin stretched taut over hollow bones. Its eyes were black, empty voids, and when it opened its mouth, a scream tore through the air, a scream that wasn't a sound but a wave of pure, raw terror. Andy couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. Beneath the frozen veil, the voice crooned, this time with the voice of 1,000 lost souls. "You've come too close, Andy." The figure reached out, its hands stretching unnaturally long, its fingers clawing at the air. And then, just as it was about to touch him, the floor beneath him cracked. He stumbled back, the room spinning. He reached for Diane, but she was no longer there. The hallway had vanished. The house was no longer the house. It was a void, an empty space filled with nothing but darkness and cold. The figure in front of him was now towering over him, its fingers inches from his face. "Help me," the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't the figure's voice. It was Diane's. The world spun. Everything was spinning. And then, in that final moment of clarity, Andy realized what the storm was, what the frozen veil truly was. It was the barrier between life and death. And they had crossed it. The figure's hand closed around his throat. And then, nothing. If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here the darkness is always waiting just for you.